This girl is blind. This boy is mentally handicapped. This boy's emotional maladjustment has led him to court. These children are members of the community. They are handicapped. But most important of all, they are children, with appetites and needs for the things which all children need: love, security, confidence, and recognition. And they need our help.
Less than 1/3 of our educable mentally handicapped are provided for within our public schools. It is essential that society provide the kinds of education that will enable these children to grow up into emotionally healthy individuals.
People with disabilities couldn't get an education in a public school. I mean, if you can believe it, in the United States, children could not get a public school education.
All the students were segregated. Special needs, hard of hearing, hearing impaired, students that had intellectual disability. Whatever their disability, they were out in one school.
It is up to all of us as parents, neighbors, and as individual members of society to do all we can to help all children achieve the maximum of their potentiality. If a child is exceptional, he will require special and exceptional understanding and help. As we can, we must provide this so that these children can more effectively take their place as contributing members of society.
Sitting at the crossroads of educational brilliance and desperation is the child with disabilities. All children, whether twice exceptional or coping with physical handicaps, have the right to be educated and to prosper. For most of history, however, those with disabilities did not have this right, as they were often institutionalized and sealed off from the world in deplorable conditions.
The average American never knew what went on inside these institutions. Far from any love or any care, these people were just mistreated, and horribly so.
States did not feel they had the responsibility to educate every child. If a child with disabilities was fortunate enough to be educated, he or she was segregated, put into a separate disadvantaged school, or discriminated against. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement reached its climax, resulting in civil liberties for racial and ethnic minorities. However, there is still a long fight to attain similar rights for educating those with disabilities. It would take the passage of federal legislation in 1975, Public Law 94 and 42, to ensure that all states were held responsible for addressing the educational rights of students with disabilities. In the early 1970s, two seminal court cases addressing the educational rights of students with disabilities served as catalysts for significant change in federal educational policy. In Park v. Pennsylvania and Mills v. the District of Columbia, the courts determined that school districts are bound by the 14th Amendment to provide an education for all children, regardless of disability.
Advocacy groups and parents of youngsters with disabilities sued in court to ensure that their youngsters also received a public education. They won in these two cases I just mentioned, and almost immediately then advocacy organizations all across the United States started bringing lawsuits to guarantee the rights of their children. And that's what eventually led to the federal government getting involved and passing that law.
After numerous other court decisions supporting the educational rights of students with disabilities, federal legislation was written. However, President Ford believed the law was too expensive with overwhelming paperwork and would not result in the government being held appropriately responsible for ensuring the educational rights for students with disabilities.
Well, before the passage of the law, there were all sorts of violations, and I couldn't say there were actually violations because the laws were not written to the effect that schools would have to follow something very specific, but certainly I would say the educational rights and the moral rights of children to an education were violated. There were a few groups of advocates that didn't feel that the education provided to kids with disabilities was appropriate, and they started just fighting for the rights of children, and it happened pretty much at the same time. I think overall the civil rights movement contributed to that.
So in essence, what had happened is the educations they did receive tended to be segregated, sometimes not even in public schools. There were sometimes, oftentimes, parents would band together, parents of youngsters with disabilities would band together and hold classes in libraries.
Finally, under intense pressure from Congress, the Office of Civil Rights, and disabled advocacy groups, President Ford signed PL 94 and 42, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, into law on November 29, 1975. For the first time in history, the educational rights of students with disabilities and the responsibility of the government were legislated.
The federal government couldn't tell states they had to meet that law. What they had to do is they had to say to states, here, we have a lot of money that we will give you if you pass your own laws that mirror our law.
President Ford was not alone in his opposition to the law. When President Reagan took office in 1981, he and Vice President Bush immediately attempted to defund PL 94 and 42 in an effort to deregulate the government. This would have resulted in limiting the responsibility of the government for educating its citizens with disabilities.
Everybody thinks that sort of warm and fuzzy thoughts about Ronald Reagan. I don't have any warm and fuzzy thoughts about Ronald Reagan. He tried to cut this program so that the education would not be available. I thank God that even up to today, at least the law is on the books. Whether or not people are paying attention, that remains to be seen.
I don't think people really knew what then President Reagan had proposed, namely to repeal this law, do away with it, take it off the books, and to cut the funding way, way back. Senator Weicker and our staff did a lot of work to inform people what was going on and that they should contact their elected officials and make sure they oppose what the then president was trying to do. And Senator Weicker led that fight, and it was a long fight.
The Reagan administration came under intense criticism from the public and Capitol Hill for the proposed cutbacks to PL 94 and 42. In 1983, due to tens of thousands of letters and cards sent defending the law, the educational rights of students with disabilities were saved from elimination. Approximately every 5 years, PL 94 and 42 goes through a reauthorization process, in which the rights of students with disabilities and the responsibilities of the government to educate them were refined and renewed.
It took over 30, 40 years to really develop these specific details. In general, though, I do think that outside the school setting, it had a great impact just overall on the community and the quality of life that people with disabilities have in the United States.
So we have students that are reading. We have students that are working on life skills. So we address their needs through their IEP goals. So it's really developed appropriately for each individual student. I'm seeing special education students where they're a priority and not just an afterthought, and that's what's exciting.
So if this law had not been passed, what would have probably happened is you'd have a great variability in some states. Some states doing an excellent job, some states doing so-so, some states doing nothing at all.
Just overall, the society would be so divided and inappropriate. I honestly cannot even imagine describing what it would be like. It would be something like looking back into the classroom of the 40s, 1940s, and something terrible, dark, and not appropriate.
What everybody fails to understand is we're all Americans. We all have the same rights. And by rights, I mean to happiness and to living a productive life. We don't divide on that.
I can't imagine the growth would be the same at all if we weren't on a mainstream campus where we had these wonderful opportunities for students that had special needs to be integrated with the rest of the general education population. The students at my school and our program with students with autism are very well cared for, accepted, loved by the entire school and student body. It's a very positive place to be.
Ultimately, the government's responsibility to protect the rights of the handicapped through Public Law 94 and 42 opened the door of education for those with disabilities, providing individualized instruction, greater opportunities, and better preparing them for the future.
And it is also a challenge that we as a community and as individuals must accept as ours. And as we continue and greatly expand our efforts to help the exceptional child, we must keep in mind that the child with a handicap is yet a child. An exceptional child with a life that may be restricted, sometimes even distorted, but a life that can grow and continue to grow toward fulfillment. As we know more about the total growth of the child with a handicap, we will be able to help the exceptional child more in his quest for happier, more secure relationships in life, with the hope that if he cannot completely eliminate his handicaps, he may effectively reduce the restrictions they cause.